El Dorado, sometimes referred to as the lost city of Z. Now, El Dorado is commonly associated with the legend of a gold city, kingdom, or empire. Originally, El Hombro Dorado, or the Golden Man, or El Rey Dorado, the Golden King, was the term used by the Spanish in the 16th century to describe a mythical tribal chief or king of the Muisca people, an indigenous people of the Altiplano Cundiboyacense of Colombia, who, as an initiation rite, covered himself with gold dust and submerged into Lake Guatavita. Sounds pretty fantastical. Now, El Dorado, in many instances, was a mythical city, said to be rich with gold, and first reported in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. The rumored location of El Dorado is disputed in different sources, but most commonly said to have been in South America. And many explorers and those seeking gold or fortune searched for El Dorado. However, according to the Journal of Historian, El Dorado was in fact a combination of several myths, rather than just one fixed location. And in some accounts, El Dorado is a man. In other accounts, a lake or a valley. And by 1835, the myth of El Dorado was already 3 centuries old. But its origin and whether a real city of gold existed was still disputed. Now, one of the most famous El Dorado origin stories was first mentioned when Juan de Castellanos, who we're looking at here, a conquistador turned priest, included it as part of his verse, History of Spanish Heroism in the Americas. And that book is called Iglesias de Varones Ilustrias de Indias. And this was written back in the 1570s. Now, according to the World History Encyclopedia, the story relates to the chief of the Muisca tribe. Now, these people inhabited the large plateau called the Cundinamarca, high in the eastern range of the Andes in what is now Colombia. The story tells that once a year, the chief would cover himself from head to foot in turpentine and gold dust. This is from where the name El Dorado, which translates to the Golden One, derives. And we're looking at one of those Muisca chiefs. And here, another depiction. According to Castellanos, the chief took a barge out into the middle of Lake Guatavita, which we can see here in this ancient map. A small, almost circular crater sunk in the mountain. The chief's people looked on. And I think we have another shot here, which makes it look much more like a crater. Now, according to Castellanos, the chief took a barge out into this lake, kind of like a circular crater lake, and the chief's people were looking on from the shores. Voices were raised in song as once the chief was in the center of the lake, made an offering of gold and emeralds to the lake. He then dove in, and this was the signal for the festival to begin. Now, there is no record of anyone ever having seen this ritual. It was said to have been discontinued some 40 or 50 years before the Spanish arrived. And even as a recount here, it was already a memorial practice when the Spanish first encountered it. The second version of the El Dorado origin story dates back to 1541. Around 20 years after Cortez conquered the Aztecs, and 8 years after the Incan emperor Atahualpa had been murdered by Francisco Pizarro. At this point in history, The Spanish hadn't yet ventured into very much of the continent, meaning much of the territory was yet unexplored by Europeans. Now, the 1541 version of the El Dorado myth is found in the writings of a conquistador named Gonzalo Fernandez de Olivedo. And here we can see a stunning representation of this particular man. Now, according to Oviedo, in Quito, in northern Ecuador, this territory at the time was newly conquered as part of the Spanish destruction of the Incas. Now, according to Oviedo, quoted in the book Morning El Dorado, El Dorado was a great lord or monarch who constantly goes about covered with gold, as fine as ground salt. For it is his opinion that to wear any other adornment is less beautifying. But to powder oneself with gold is an extraordinary thing, unusual and new and more costly. Now, in February 1541, another Spanish conquistador named González Pizarro gathered a small force of men and set off from Quito, Ecuador, in search of the land and the mythical king of El Dorado. In his own accounts of his adventure, Pizarro describes El Dorado as a lake, not a man. I wonder if it's this lake. A third contemporary source, the chronicler Pedro de Cieza de Leon, describes the very same expedition and writes of El Dorado as a valley. Now, Pizarro headed east from Quito with several hundred conquistadors. The sources vary between 220 and 340, and an additional 4,000 native servants. They had been kept in chains and shackles, together with horses, llamas, and some 2,000 hogs, and a similar number of hunting dogs. Well, they went off on an expedition. Pizarro was a strapping lad, now wasn't he? Now, Pizarro expected shortly to find civilization, including open land, tilled fields, villages, and towns. Instead, marching for weeks and months through the darkness of the rainforest in the rainy season, across mountains, marshes, and rivers, he found nothing but, in the words of Cieza de Leon, hardship, famine, and misery. Along the way, native people were captured and interrogated by the Spanish. When they didn't come up with answers Pizarro wanted, they were tortured. As the end of the year approached, things became desperate. All the hogs were dead, and they came to a great river, most likely the Coca, just south of the equator in what is now northern Ecuador. There, a local tribe chief named De la Cola, having heard of the cruelties the Spanish had visited on those they questioned, told them what they wanted to hear. There were very great populations further on downriver, he told them, and very rich regions full of powerful lords. Pizarro ordered a boat to be built. It would carry men and supplies downstream, while the remaining men and horses made their way along the shore. They proceeded this way for 43 more days, but found little food and no people. Pizarro had been duped. In December 1541, one of Pizarro's men, Francisco de Orellana, volunteered to take a boat and some 50 men to find food and return. He would bring back provisions as soon as he could, he told Pizarro. Orellana did find food, but he never returned. Instead, he and his men found the Amazon, which they knew as the Marañón, and they rode its length for months, reaching the Atlantic on August 26, 1542. Orellana claimed he had no choice but to continue on, as there was no way to maneuver back upstream. Pizarro called it treason, and he turned his remaining men around and made their way slowly back to Quito. They ate their dogs and horses, boiled up their saddles and stirrup leathers, and roasted them over ashes. Somehow, they made it, staggering into Quito in June. Now, this El Dorado story demonstrates how the myth became one of the principal drivers for European exploration of South America near the equator. Pizarro was the first explicit attempt to find El Dorado. But once stories of the Golden Land spread, more conquistadors began claiming that their journeys of exploration into the interior had been in search of it. Fascinating. And that brings us to the most recent controversial trip to look for El Dorado. And in this case, and by this time, it was named the Lost City of Z. Now, the Lost City of Z is the name given by Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett, who you're looking at here, a British surveyor to an indigenous city that he believed had existed in the jungle of the Mato Grosso state of Brazil. Based on early histories of South America and his own explorations of the Amazon River region, Fawcett theorized that complex civilizations once existed there, and that isolated ruins may have survived. Now, ironically enough, the earlier explorers in the 1500s were literally walking by these giant cities, and the natives knew it, but they were covered in jungle, and unless you were directed directly to them, were completely invisible. And that is the ruse. But let's move on to Fawcett, because he was onto something. In fact, Fawcett had made expeditions into South America multiple times. And here we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 expeditions, the first beginning in 1906. And the fateful expedition, which began in 1925, ended in catastrophe. Now, Fawcett found a document known as Manuscript 512, which was held at the National Library of Brazil. It was believed to have been written by Portuguese. According to the document, in 1753, a group of bandeirantes discovered the ruins of an ancient city that contained arches, statues, and temples with hieroglyphs. He described the city ruins in great detail without giving its location. Now, Manuscript 512 was written after explorations made in the Cerrado of the province Bahia. Fawcett intended to pursue finding this city as a secondary goal after he found the lost city of Z. He was preparing an expedition to find the lost city of Z when World War I broke out and the British government suspended its support. Fawcett returned to Britain and served on the Western Front during the war. In 1920, Fawcett undertook a personal expedition to find the city, but withdrew after suffering from fever and having to shoot his pack animal. On a second expedition 5 years later, Fawcett, his son Jack, and Jack's friend Raleigh Rymel disappeared in the Mato Grosso jungle forever. And this is his fateful last trip here in 1925, making it hundreds of miles into the interior and disappearing. Researchers believe that Fawcett may have been influenced in his thinking by information obtained from indigenous people about the archaeological site of Quihucugu, near the headwaters of the Xingu River. After Fawcett's presumed death in the jungle, Kuhinguku was discovered by Westerners in 1925, and the site contains the ruins of an estimated 20 towns and villages in which as many as 50,000 people might have once lived. Then, the discovery of other large geometrical earthworks in interfluvial settings in southern Amazonia has since been recognized as supporting Fawcett's theory of the lost city of Z. Now, unfortunately, the demise of Fawcett was probably not as simple as malaria or dengue or some other Amazonian fever. But it is my supposition that the natives had been restless and had been visited by white people for hundreds of years, and they were sick of it. They were protecting their history, a history that they may have been or may not have been aware of as far as what actually occurred, but they knew that where they were living, the ancients had also lived. And I think Fawcett and his crew met a horrible death at the hands of potentially cannibals. But the beauty of this story is that in 2022, LiDAR studies have begun uncovering the massive city structures that all of these men were looking for. Now, no huge amounts of gold have been found that we know of, but there are conspiracy theories out there that local governments and other secret groups and nefarious groups have moved in here in the 1980s and removed all the gold before the archaeologists were allowed to come in. And now we're getting pictures using 3D animation created using data from LiDAR, showing urban centers all over this area where El Dorado is supposed to be. And in fact, El Dorado was many things. It was the Golden City. It was the Golden King. It was the Muisca people and more. There are dozens of large cities in the center of South America, Colombia, Ecuador, all in this region, all of which are lost cities and now found, thanks to LiDAR. And in fact, thousands of them. Now here's where a city is located right here. Can you see it? And do you think any of the explorers that were walking by this city saw pyramids? Here's a pyramid. And roads? No. There's no way to know. But now we know, thanks to LiDAR, that there were massive highways and roads in all directions, canals and causeways that were diverting water in these major cities. And there is more to be uncovered. And this is not a good LiDAR page to show you. But all the links will be below to everything we talked about. Take a look at some of these extensive city plans. Mind-boggling. And this has only recently been revealed. It would take generations of archaeologists to come out to some of these sites just to interpret half of the history. These are 3,000 years old, these cities, or older. The Muisca people date back to 1250 BC. And if they built these cities, then they're at least 3,000 years old. But it is my supposition that they are simply on the foundation of even older cities. And these are massive complexes. Look at the number of pyramids here. The entire city is raised up tens of feet above the jungle floor. That would take hundreds of thousands of people years to accomplish. Yet here we're looking at what they accomplished. And this, or maybe even this, is El Dorado. And that's a boom to knowledge. I hope you got something out of the video. It was a pleasure creating this for you. You have any questions, leave them below. All we ask you is you share this video with people that may watch it. We love you. Be safe.